Welcome to the John Cain, excuse me, I've had a cold, hopefully my voice will hold up. Welcome to the John Cain Luncheon for May. It is lovely to see you. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I don't know what's going on with this. There we go. And thank them for their custodianship of the lands on which we meet over many generations. Lands which were never ceded. I am, as you know, Emma Dawson, Executive Director at Per Capita. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the May John Cain Lunch, where we will be hearing from our friend Daniel Mulino, who has joined us before, of course. Daniel is the member for Fraser in the Albanese government. He was here last year to talk to us about his book on the welfare state, which was incredibly well-received conversation and a great book, and if you haven't read it, do so already. It's called do so now. It's called Safety Net: The Future of Welfare in Australia. But Daniel is also chair of the very important House Economics Committee, and as such we thought he would be a great person to talk to us today to unpack last week's federal budget, the third Chalmers budget of the Albanese government. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us.
So the people online can hear you.
Yeah, great.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thanks very much. Can I also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thanks, Emma, and can I thank Per Capita for the huge contribution that it makes. So thanks to Emma and the whole team. We need our think tanks in Australia, I believe, for the health of our democracy and the quality of our public discourse. And I think last time I came here, we were either just in or just out of government, just in opposition towards the end of it or just out. But I mean, one of the points I made then was that in opposition particularly, I think, Per Capita was an incredibly important source of ideas and the testing of ideas for the Labor Party. But look, it's equally true in government. I think government is a time when we are faced with extremely complex challenges, often unexpectedly, and I just want to acknowledge all the work that this organisation does. There are many other important people in the room, and I'm kind of loath to start acknowledging people because then I'll inadvertently not acknowledge somebody important. But look, I'm very conscious that I'm presenting here to a very knowledgeable audience, so it's a privilege but also a little bit daunting. But hopefully you're thrilled with my incredible PowerPoint skills for this opening slide. It's a sign of things to come. But look, I wanted to present a short-term context and a long-term context for this budget. The short-term context is that this is the first supply-side shock for a long time. And I'm sure you've talked about this a lot over the last few months, but I think it's worth stating that this is a particularly challenging set of macroeconomic conditions that is not the norm. More often than not, when there are macroeconomic shocks, whether it be a business cycle downturn, a financial sector shock, or whatever it might be, there's generally an opportunity for governments to lean in. And if you look at the GFC, for example, or COVID, at both times, governments lent in very heavily, particularly at the federal level. Now, there was argy-bargy between the parties as to what it looked like, how much, and you have to have that argy-bargy, but there was generally agreement that the governments should lean in to support aggregate demand. I mean, it kind of goes back to, and I'm probably paraphrasing totally out of context, but Nixon back in the 70s saying we're all Keynesians now. But look, it's generally agreed, I think, amongst most macroeconomists and policymakers and politicians that, in those kinds of shocks you lean in. For me, a supply-side shock is different in that it's a bit trickier in that when you lean in too much, you become part of the inflation problem. So I saw recently a really interesting video, or interesting in inverted commas, eye of the beholder probably, by Alan Blinder, a macroeconomist at Princeton, who's a very, very renowned academic, but also been on Federal Reserve boards. And he was looking at the last 10 or so monetary policy cycles in the US. And what he found was that soft landings are very hard to achieve. So they're not the norm, and arguably very rare, firstly. Secondly, is that if you go back, and not all that far, monetary and policy and fiscal policy weren't particularly aligned. So if you go back to the last supply side shock, for example, in the US, which he was focusing on, Nixon's fiscal policy was not particularly aligned with monetary policy. And interestingly, if you go back to a lot of public policy documents in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a much different version, a much different view as to where the responsibility lay in terms of fiscal and monetary policy, in terms of managing aggregate demand. So I simply make the point that when you have a supply side shock, it's not a simple matter of the government leaning in to support aggregate demand. There has to be a lot more alignment between monetary policy and fiscal policy. It's trickier. I think that over the first two budgets that we brought in, by and large, there was a broad agreement that inflation had spiked because of global factors, post-COVID supply chain factors, and the war in the Ukraine, and that the Reserve Bank needed to raise interest rates. Having said that, there was also a broad acknowledgement that there was a role for the federal government in providing targeted assistance to people. I'm going to argue in a minute that I think there's much less consensus at the moment as to how fiscal and monetary policy should be working together. But the first point of that dot point is simply to say that when you are in this situation of a supply side shock, I think the alignment of fiscal and monetary policy is a much trickier balancing act to achieve, I would argue, than in other kinds of macro shocks. The second point I want to make is that inflation has come down significantly. So we've had a lot of discussion post-budget and in the lead up to the budget over the fact that inflation is still above the 2 to 3% band. The rate at which it's coming down has slowed. But I do think it's worth noting contextually that at a monthly rate, inflation was above 8% in December 2022. It has come down pretty consistently to be under 4% now. On a quarterly rate, it was almost 8%, 7.8 I think it peaked at, and is now at 3.6. So a significant reduction in inflation. And while the 2 to 3% band is important, sometimes I kind of take myself back to when I was studying economics back in the 80s and 90s, and we hadn't conquered inflation in the way we have now, but it is always kind of worth putting into context that we're talking about 0.6% to get down to the top of the band. It is important that we do so and important that the RBA maintains its credibility, but I think it's important to acknowledge that inflation has come down a long way and is continuing to track down. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that other countries who have gotten to this point have found that it firstly can get a bit sticky, and secondly doesn't necessarily track down in a uniform and linear way. Unemployment remains low, which is fantastic. I mean, it's not mission accomplished on the deck of the aircraft carrier, and there are people who are feeling a lot of pain, but if we had been offered the current unemployment rate for having brought inflation down to where it is, I feel very confident that the Cabinet, the Treasurer, the Prime Minister would have taken it. And look, I'm in an electorate where people are doing it tough, but it would have been a lot worse if unemployment was mid-fours or high fours. So I've just got a kind of rhetorical question there. What is Nauru? I mean, it's interesting that this is clearly in the Reserve Bank's thinking. And when Michelle Bullock goes out and says, I feel as though unemployment's probably going to have to get to 4.5, I interpret her comments to mean that's where she thinks Nauru is. Of course, none of us can observe Nauru, and that's an important point to make, I think. But I think she's been more careful with her words than her predecessor, because I think the RBA has learned how potent the central bank's words are. But I think it's an interesting question as to, will unemployment have to go up much more in order for us to get to within the 2 to 3 band, and now in fact to get to 2.5, which is now an explicit target. So that's the short run context, that it is a tricky balancing act. Inflation's come down a lot, but there is a stickiness potentially And that's the context in which we frame the budget. The longer term is that productivity growth remains a challenge, and I think it's worth noting that. I don't think that necessarily frames the kind of current fiscal settings overly much, but it does impact on how we think about the budget and some of the longer term challenges we need to fix. Now, I'm stealing 3 slides in this, but I'm going to talk to them myself and put my own spin on them. But this is from Chris Richardson. So I was at a post-budget breakfast with Chris Richardson and Ben Phillips from an ANU academic. I've taken this from Chris. I mean, you could get this from just about anywhere, but I thought this was a nice way of framing it. He's looking at disposable income per head. Look, you could look at GDP per capita. You could look at productivity growth. You could look at all sorts of different measures. But look, the bottom line is, I think, if you look at the way our economy was performing in the lead up to the Hawke-Keating years, it was stagnating. The Hawke-Keating years, I would argue, were a time of very profound and important reforms. Some of the impacts of those reforms came through in terms of productivity with a lag. And so from some time in the, say, mid-90s, we then saw 2 decades of uninterrupted growth. Now, did some of the things the Howard government did that continue that? Look, I don't want to get too much into that because I'm a little bit biased on these things, but look, bottom line is we had 2 decades of growth following that. And for me, that's a reflection of the fact that there are benefits to having a significant, coherent reform agenda. It can have long-term benefits for the economy, but for society. So this is disposable income per head. You could obviously put all sorts of distributional, analysis on top of this, but look, a lot of people in Labor heartland benefited over decades because of this. So obviously the last 10 to 15 years have been not good. And you see the trend line now flattening again. And this is, again, an important piece of context, I think, for our budget, because our budget is balancing both the need to get inflation down to 2.5, but it's also trying to frame how do we undertake long-term reforms so as to make our service economy, our care economy more productive, more sustainable, which for me is an absolutely critical issue. And that was actually a lot of what my book was about. How do we get better outcomes in that economy, like better outcomes for people that we actually understand and measure, but in a way that is sustainable for the budget? How do we transition the economy to a net zero economy? So for me, these are they're both productivity challenges, but also quality of life issues. But in a sense, they're all ultimately, I think, interrelated in that when you're measuring productivity properly, you're measuring outcomes. So I think this is also an important piece of context. Now, the next slide, before I get onto a couple of, and I should preface my comments today by saying I'm not really going to give you a shopping list of programs, because I kind of feel like most of you know that I'm really going to give you my thoughts on the environment and the framing of it more and we'll have plenty of questions and answers for people to talk through particular programs. So I've kind of focused more on the bigger picture in these opening remarks. The next observation I make is uncertainty. And this is something which used to be far more prominent in economics. So risk and uncertainty are 2 critical concepts, I believe. So risk is tossing a coin or rolling a dice or playing at a roulette table. You know what the odds are and you can measure it pretty accurately. Assuming it's a fair roulette table and a fair coin. Predicting a war, especially a war maybe off in the future, that's uncertainty. It's almost impossible to put numbers on it. Now, in public policy and in the real world, we often face uncertainty. And in fact, what we face in the real world is a whole series of situations that are on a spectrum. The kinds of scenarios where it's more like a coin being tossed or a dice being rolled, that is the exception. And things that are totally uncertain, they're also the exception, because we can usually put pretty good prior odds on something. But the reality is, I believe, we face uncertainty in many situations. Now, why does it matter? Well, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. The first example is from the predecessor of the CIA, a Yale graduate called Sherman Kent, who was asked by the State Department in the mid-50s, what's the likelihood of the Soviet Union invading Hungary? And he said, oh, it's quite probable. And they said, oh, thanks for that advice, that's really useful. And so the State Department went off and made whatever decisions they made. And then a little while later, the State Department came back to Sherman Kent and said, oh, by the way, what did you mean when you said quite probable? And he said, well, I meant about 65%. And he said, oh, because we took it to mean much less than the balance of probabilities. And he said, oh, okay, so that's not good. And so Sherman Kent then went back to his team and said, so you know when we wrote that it was quite probable, what did you think when we put that into that briefing note for the State Department? And they all came up with numbers from 20 to 80%. So nobody had a clue what they were talking about with these odds, quite apart from the fact that who can put an odd on it anyway. But then what they did was they decided to come up with 5 word forms with a range of probabilities for each. So that's more now what they do. So when President Obama was being asked, should we go into Abbottabad or not, because they had a sense that Osama bin Laden was in there, but they didn't know, he went round the table and then got numerical estimates from all his advisors. But is that much better? I mean, what do you do with that? Do you just average them all? Do you kind of go with, do you do a weighted average like Nate Silver does with all the polls, which works pretty well? So, you know, it's something that national security experts are still struggling with. So that's one context. But in economics, it matters a lot. If you go back to the 1930s, some of the greatest economists were thinking about uncertainty. So Frank Knight at the University of Chicago talked about uncertainty as being at the core of entrepreneurship, and that entrepreneurs are the people who are willing to take on uncertain projects. And I think Frank Knight's work is critical because I see it as a precursor to Mariana Mazzucato, and there's a very close lineage there to all of her profound work on what are some of the interventions made by government which led to the development of, you know, the iPhone and you know, all sorts of other things. So the uncertainty in entrepreneurship and innovation is absolutely profound. But there was another person who was a statistician and important logician who also talked about uncertainty and also did quite a lot of economics, called John Maynard Keynes. And so obviously did a lot of economics. But he wrote very profound pieces on statistics and probability. He got into arguments with another great economist, Ramsey, again, who had very, very profound debates about the very foundations of probability. But Keynes thought that uncertainty was absolutely central to economics. It was central to people's long-run investment decisions, central to the LM curve and the way people make decisions there. And I think we've lost a lot of that. But the reason I raise all of this is that if you look at where we are in the monetary policy cycle, if you go back 12 months when the Reserve Bank was starting to raise interest rates, I would argue that was a time when most economists, most public policy experts, most politicians would have said, we need to raise interest rates a few times in order to constrain aggregate demand, in order to bring things more in alignment. They might disagree on how many, but they would have said that's broadly where we are in the cycle. And the first 2 budgets we brought down were largely received as being in an environment where everybody conceded that inflation was international, everybody conceded monetary policy needed to be tight, and that what the government was doing in our first 2 budgets was giving targeted cost of living assistance to people that really needed it. I think we are now at the stage of the monetary policy cycle where just about every decision is more 50-50, and at every decision almost, you've got serious macroeconomists who I respect on either side of the decision, because there is a great deal of uncertainty at this point. One of the tensions that the RBA is grappling with is the fact that they know that there are lagged effects coming through from earlier interest rate rises. We don't know exactly how lagged effects work, but many macroeconomists believe that each individual rate rise can have effects anywhere from 6 to 18 months after it's brought in. So we can be pretty confident there are more lagged effects coming through. We see that consumption is coming down. We see that there is pain in much of the economy. Unemployment, as I mentioned, is not as high as we thought, but it is probably starting to track up now. But on the other hand, the RBA is facing the prospect that if it doesn't see inflation coming down soon, inflation could remain above the band for years, 3 years or more. Now, they worry on the other side about the fact that does that lead to a re-anchoring of everybody's expectations in the economy? Now, some people say that's an overblown worry, but look, in a sense, that's what they're there for. And so there's this tension point they're feeling. So my committee, the House Economics Committee, undertakes 3 hours of public grilling of the governor every 6 months. And this tension point has been examined in a lot of detail at those points. And and previous to her, Philip Lowe, have been very explicit that that's at the heart of a lot of the juggle they're making. They don't want to cause unnecessary pain in the economy. They understand there are lagged effects coming through, but they also worry that if inflation remains above the band for 3.5, potentially 4 years, does that lead to a re-anchoring of expectations to a higher point that would be extremely hard to budge? And Philip Lowe would often make the point, if we don't get it down to 3 soon, the pain of getting it down after that would be far more. So there's we can all have views on, whether they've made the wrong or right call, but I guess I just wanted to kind of frame that I think that is at its heart, at this point in the cycle, a question that involves uncertainty. It's very, very tricky. I think the government is making decisions involving uncertainty around how will people respond to various key measures. We've rejigged the stage 3 tax cuts. Like, how much of that will people save? How much will they spend? How will they respond to this $300 subsidy of their energy bills? Like, these are very hard things to model. You ultimately have to model them. And there's been a little bit of a divergence between the RBA and the Treasury modelling on inflation. Part of that was that they were done at different times, but part of it is reflecting the fact that there are now just different results coming out of different macro models across the big banks and various models. So government is also acting in a time of uncertainty. What I would also observe is that I think it's worth remembering that the government makes decisions less frequently at a macro level than the RBA. So the government is making budget decisions once a year. Now, you can do a mini budget, but governments tend not to want to do that. The RBA is making decisions every 6 weeks. So if we're both managing uncertainty, how do you each manage that in the context of different timelines? And I think that's a relevant factor. On this particular point, I just wanted to finish by saying, yes, there's uncertainty, but we also do know a few things. So we know that a lot of people are doing it tough. I mean, I talk to people every day. I see that in my electorate. It's in the stats. There are people who have had their real disposable income going backwards. We look at the impact across different distributional groups. We know that inflation is tracking down. So we know that we're heading on a good trajectory. We don't know exactly how quickly it's going to go through that last 0.6 into the band and then get down to 2.5, but we know it's come down a long way and the trajectory is still heading in the right direction. And we know, we're quite confident that people haven't re-anchored their views yet. That's based on surveys, it's based on bond markets, it's based on whole sorts of things. But even the RBA has said in testimony that I've seen, they don't feel that people have re-anchored yet. So it's not something to ignore. I don't think it should be totally downplayed, but I don't think they have re-anchored their expectations at a higher level yet. And I think we know that many of the supply side issues have unwound. So many of the supply chain issues have unwound, not totally, but many have. So with all of those things we know, my view, which you won't be totally surprised, aligns with the treasurers and the budgets and the government's view, but my view is that it would have been, in that context, not appropriate to go to a budget that was framed around austerity. Our budget had a surplus. In the last 2 years, we have dramatically turned around the fiscal position. But, as Chris Richardson will point out in his table of truth, there were some spending decisions that led to more spending. But in my view, given all of those things I just outlined that we do know, I felt that the amount of spending that we made, targeted to people that need it, I felt that it was appropriate given the risks on each side. And as I said, we make budgets once a year. We can adjust a little bit around that, but if new information comes to hand, then the RBA is there to adjust every 6 weeks. But for me, it would have been premature, based on everything we know, to go to a more austerity-oriented framework. And some of the people that say we should have done that, and I don't want to get too partisan here, but some members of the opposition who say that we're spending up big and they'll give you all of these huge numbers that Labor's spending since coming to power. But if you look at what contributes to some of those large numbers, indexing the pension is a huge contribution to that. I mean, is anybody on the other side seriously saying we shouldn't index the pension? And so some, I think, on the other side, but some also amongst economists will say that we think you should have spent less, but very rarely do they actually spell out where. And I think, for me, that's telling. So I think uncertainty to me is an interesting topic per se. I wanted to emphasise it today in this speech because I actually feel we are at the uncertain part of the monetary cycle. And I think that is a big challenge for government and for the central bank. But you've got to make decisions. It just, I think, changes the way in which you make decisions. Now, the last couple of slides I'll go through quickly. But as I said, I'm not going to give you a shopping list, but in terms of, I just wanted to give you a kind of broad brush distributional takeout of the budget rather than kind of selling you on each individual item. But so I'm going to give you some modelling by Ben Phillips, who's I think a really interesting and rigorous academic at the ANU who looks at the distributional impacts of budgets in a range of ways. So this modelling I'm about to show you in the next 2 slides includes all the big stuff, not absolutely every measure in the budget, but it includes the tax cuts, and that's the big one. So our tax cuts in the end were obviously quite different to what we had inherited from the Liberal Party. They were obviously oriented much more towards lower income earners. People on 18 to 45 got a tax cut of $800 a year. Previously they got nothing. And in my electorate that means a lot to people. People on anything up to mid 100s do materially better under our version than under the Liberals' version. So it is a redistributive shift in those stage 3 tax cuts. Broadly speaking, the same amount in aggregate, but that was a big part of the distributional impacts. Rent assistance has gone up again, and I think it's the first successive increase for a long time, but obviously critically important given housing. And look, people may want to discuss housing, a very big, complicated issue, but I think in terms of the short-term issues we needed to deal with in the budget, a rental increase is definitely in order. The energy rebate, now that was a part of the budget which wasn't means tested, and happy to discuss that. I mean, fundamentally, based on my experience as a public servant, going way back in finance and other departments, and also having worked in a utilities regulator, look, I think it would be very hard for us to have means tested it in any time where it could have gone through to the people that needed it this year. I actually think also in the very big scheme of things, like some $300 subsidies going out to very high income earners, in the scheme of a bigger budget redistribution pattern, it didn't mean that much, but the $300 going to people on low incomes and benefits in my electorate will mean a lot. So that pragmatic trade-off I think was worth it. So there's a range of measures, and I just wanted to kind of give you a sense firstly of the impact of this budget on disposable income in each quintile. So that's the blue line, and obviously quintile 1 is lowest income, quintile 5 highest. So look, it's a redistributive pattern, and the impact of the budget is a shift in disposable income, taking everything into account. Ben also comes up with a financial well-being measure, which is more holistic than income, and I think takes into account certain transfers and also wealth impacts, but bottom line is very similar stories. So same thing broadly in terms of where the extra money is being spent. Now, you'll see that in terms of aggregate dollars, the aggregate dollars on the lowest quintile isn't as much as the second and third, but the percentage impact is more. So again, without getting into all the numbers, because I'm sure other academics could, slightly tweak these. But look, I think Ben is a very rigorous economist. But the bottom line for me is that this is a budget where we did spend a bit, But I think in the scheme of things, it was responsible given the inflationary risks on the horizon, but it was also consciously spent in a targeted and redistributive way. So that's the high level summary of the budget. I think it is a good budget for these times, but as I said right on the first slide, I think supply side shocks are tricky, particularly at this point in the monetary and business cycle. There's also some longer term measures in there, which I don't have in the slides, that come under the rubric of Future Made in Australia, and that includes a range of measures around, the energy transition, critical minerals, and so forth. So happy to talk about that. So there are some measures dealing with the longer term, and then obviously if you look at some of the longer term productivity challenges, we're also doing things in the space of skills. And this morning I was at an event on behalf of Brendan O'Connor, where a skills provider in my own electorate recently crowned their 700,000th apprentice. So that was a very uplifting event. Far more uplifting than appearing on Sky News later tonight. But anyway, so the day is kind of started off very high with this and the previous event, and it'll probably end with Sky News and then a whiskey or something. But yeah, so there are some long-term measures that are trying to deal with that productivity challenge that I referred to earlier. But I thought I'd focus on the inflation challenge first and foremost. So thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to kick off with just a comment, which is something that's been driving me mad. They're spending too much. Well, the projected deficit for next year is 28.3 billion. 24 billion of that is the tax cuts that were already going to happen, right? But we've redistributed them, so let's get some perspective there, is all I'm going to say about that. Who'd like to kick us off with a question or a comment? Come on, you never hold back, okay? You were first with your hand up, sir.
So thank you.
Ask you to speak into the microphone for our friends at home.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name's Jonathan. I used to work at Treasury and Finance and PM&C and DFAT stuff.
You got all the big ones.
Sorry?
You got all the big ones.
They're less impressive than you might think in real life, but as you well know.
Yeah.
But look, I guess my question was to sort of take a frame back and to, and I'm an economist as well, so I live a pointless life, but I'm just interested in I guess the productivity agenda and reforms. I'm a kid who moved to Australia when I was 4 and 79. I lived through the Keating Hawke years. Remarkable, right? Absolutely remarkable. Where's the reforms coming from? What are they? Like, why has the government, I suppose, given up on reform? And reform is the wrong word. The Indonesians have a word, reformasi, but that means actually we're not going to do anything, basically. But what other high, I know the productivity commissions had an agenda, but I'm just interested in your views on what would be the most purposeful things that in structural terms that could be done.
It's a great question, and look, I mean, but you've raised a lot of profound existential questions about being an economist to start with. I'll go and ponder on those this afternoon. But
I say I need better hobbies.
Yeah, but look, I think for me, and again, it's always hard to go back to earlier eras. I mean, I was in Young Labor in the Hawke-Keating years, and so that's part of what inspired me to go into economics. So I don't want to judge eras through rose-coloured glasses, but part of what I think is the issue is that if you go back to the 80s, there were some reforms where most of the public policy establishment agreed they were broadly good ideas, like freeing up parts of the economy, opening up the economy. Again, we can debate it, but I'm simply not so much talking necessarily to convince everybody there's a good ideas, but more I'm trying to understand the dynamics of what was going on. So you had an opposition who was broadly on board with that, and then the question was politically, can we kind of coalesce around it? Now, even with the opposition being broadly on board with a lot of the financial sector reforms, lowering tariffs, reducing barriers to capital flows, it still took guts to do it, because there's always the opportunities for the opposition to take advantage if there's any kind of group in society who are worse off. So there's always that risk. I mean, Howard always claims I take some credit because I let it all go through and look, yeah, and some things yes, some things no. But I simply want to make the point that there were quite a few changes that were to at least some degree bipartisan. Now I think if you go to those productivity reports, State of the Nation or the 5-year update, I see far less areas of bipartisan agreement there. And there's a lot of things where you get into micro reforms of service delivery, IR, there's all sorts of things which just get very quickly into not just politically difficult decisions, but where not everybody's even on the same page. Now I think there are some areas of productivity enhancing reform where there is broad agreement, like I think skills is one area that broadly is, and I think we're certainly investing a lot in that, and I do think it will have productivity benefits. And it's not just about more money into the sector, but I think it's about thinking more innovatively. I think it's about the whole micro-credentials, there's all sorts of dimensions to it, but I think people are genuinely thinking about that. I think productivity that can come from tax reform, I just think it's almost too hard at the moment and has been for some time. I mean, the other structural thing I would say is that a lot of the reforms that I see from the 80s and 90s were economy-wide reforms, so like floating the dollar, changing tariffs. These were things that affected large parts of the economy in one fell swoop. My personal view is the next realm of productivity growth needs to be in the services economy, and I feel as though it's going to have to be almost sector by sector, which makes it much slower and messier and bespoke. And look, I think many economists would agree with that. I mean, I also kind of make the observation that we talk about productivity all the time. It's important to note, I think, that we don't even measure productivity in a third of the economy. Many parts of service delivered by government, many parts of health, many parts of education, police and justice, we don't even measure productivity. These are totally out of the picture. And yet for me, these are some of the biggest contributors to quality of life, and these are some of the areas where the productivity debate needs to go to, but we don't even know how to measure outcomes well. So for me, it's in a sense, it's an inherently more challenging time to try to achieve like big picture productivity shifts.
Singing my song on that last subject, that's my passion, measuring productivity. Go ahead. Yes, yep, just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Hi. Do you mind if I don't stand up?
No, that's fine.
My name's Claire, and I'll introduce myself. I'm Claire Leach. I've just joined Prosper as the new General Manager, for those of you who know Prosper Australia. I have big shoes to fill after Emily Sims has moved on. So my question is a little bit about what I do.
Yep.
And I've had the opportunity to give you a little bit of a warning chat before. We're interested in ultimately quite large tax reform. And I know that there is big conversation going on at the moment amongst some of the independents and people like Jackie Lambie and David Pocock are saying, negative gearing again, etc. But I also hear that Labor is a bit scared of anything to do with tax reform because of what happened at the last election with
2019, yeah.
So is it something that you think can come back to the fore on the agenda, and especially things like what Prosper is all about is taxing more of unearned incomes as opposed to earned incomes from productive labour and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I would go back even further than 2019 on tax. I think the politics of tax is very, very difficult. I think you go back to the Houston election. I think the election where Howard took the GST to the election, he had I think a 45-seat majority and came out with a 5-seat majority. I just think tax is very difficult. And again, look, I think you'd probably start from the proposition that I think some people are putting ideas out there. It's not just David Pocock and Jackie Lambie, but look, some of the Teals. But even within each side of Parliament, I think there's a wide range of views on what good tax reform would look like. The last time we had a major tax review, the Henry Review, look, I personally feel, and again, I'm sure there's a range of views in this room and certainly within Parliament, I personally feel that as a body of work has stood up very well. Like decades later, I think it's a very solid piece of work, and on individual items, I will often go back to it and feel that it's a very clear enunciation from first principles. I mean, tax is challenging. Again, I won't go into detail here, but look, for all sorts of reasons. One is that it creates very clear winners and losers often. That sometimes tax reform might lead to higher growth, but look, the pain points are very immediate, and the rhetorical devices that can be used against it, I think, are very powerful. So look, I certainly don't want to write it off. I mean, we were talking again before, so one of the things that I've looked at recently when thinking about tax reform is the Treasury paper, which came out, I think, about 5 years ago, where they looked at different types of taxation and their contribution to GST. So they looked at income taxes, corporate taxes, other taxes, so, excises and, the sales tax and GST. What surprised me was over 45, 50 years how little any of those had changed. I mean, the main one was that income taxes had increased. But it's really hard to budge those. I mean, I think last time I was here, I made the observation that I think far too much of the tax debate in Australia revolves around how we cut and splice income taxes. Like that seems to have been almost the entire tax discussion over the last 20 years. Some of the things you're raising, like how do we tax land, but also how do we tax resources better? There are, obvious counterexamples that could guide us. But I do think the other lesson that I suppose some people have said to me about public policy life is that sometimes to make a problem easier, you need to make it bigger. Now, I guess the argument with tax would be, if you're looking at just a narrow part of tax, then you're basically going to be trying to achieve something by setting the winners and the losers against each other. If you're making it bigger and more multifaceted, then some people will be gaining in some bits and losing in others, and other people will be gaining in these bits and losing in others, and you might then be more able to build a coalition. So I suspect with tax reform, the way forward might be some kind of summit where there are multiple measures and people feel that we're building a growth and a productivity agenda, and where each of us can kind of look at the package as a whole. But, without wanting to be trite, in our politics, easier said than done.
So of course, Mel Hawke did it.
Yeah.
Things were easier back then. John, yeah. Just
Thank you very much. I was impressed that you include predictability of a war amongst the factors that have to be taken into account. There's a problem, and I agree with you, that's very important. And there's no doubt that a lot of people in Australia have been encouraged to think that war is a possibility. The problem is, what does that lead you to do in the budget? And most countries, or many countries, think that it means that they should be increasing their military expenditure. But do they really recognise that that inevitably makes war more likely? If we increase our military expenditure, then that's another reason why China might. It's certainly in sympathy with what America's doing, and we look like just little copycats of America. So I think there's an enormously important debate to be had, which hasn't even begun yet, about how do we achieve peace for Australia, and is it really by increasing our military expenditure, or is it by trying to build peace in many ways, which I haven't got time to suggest.
Yeah, no, look, so, and just to clarify, so I guess the reason I started with the war example was because I think that some of those national security examples are really powerful examples of something that's inherently unpredictable. So I wasn't necessarily trying to link it too much with the budget with that example, more just to say that uncertainty, is something which rears its head in a range of contexts, one of which is war and another of which is economics. But having said that, your point is correct, that we are living in a world at the moment where Many feel that there is uncertainty about where our region is headed. Many people feel that our region is trending in a dangerous direction. And I would also concede your point that sometimes countries might try to make decisions to achieve a certain outcome but have inadvertent consequences. So let's say, to your point, let's say you were trying to increase your defence spending to make yourself safer, and that led to everybody else increasing their defence spending. So look, agreed, that dynamic could be a dangerous one. But I guess, look, the counter argument in this context might be others have raised it very, very significantly already, and we haven't budged. Now, we can debate the particulars of that, but I think there's certainly a number of people who would argue that with a number of players in our region, but look, probably one in particular, like well before we even started thinking about this, there had been very, very... Now we can debate whether that was appropriate for them, because in their context, maybe they were trying to reshift a balance that they felt was inappropriate. And that's a separate discussion around them without much in their mind, to be honest. I think they were when they do that, they're thinking about much bigger picture pieces in the puzzle. I mean, the only other thing I guess I would say on that broad point is that I totally agree we should be thinking about how we should move towards a more stable region and world, but region in particular, and a more peaceful region and world. And there are lots of things that are happening that are very hard to kind of both predict but also disentangle. But I do feel that, and I kind of feel like I've witnessed this in my public life, there are certain things that I feel have clearly happened over the last decade. When I was a state MP between 2014 and 18, every MP was encouraged to go to China. Every minister was encouraged, or more than encouraged, to go annually. So we were reaching out incredibly, and I was part of that. And I found it to be a truly fascinating experience. I mean, it's one of the world's great cultures. It was an economy on a scale that is mind-blowing, but not just the scale. What they were achieving in a qualitative sense in many areas was remarkable. To be travelling on high-speed rails, to be going to a research facility in IT and technology that was a bigger compound than most buildings you can dream of. But I think it's also fair to say that the way in which that government is interacting with the rest of the world, I think that has changed dramatically in the last decade. And it's not just us, but it's many countries in Europe, many countries in the region. Now, again, we can discuss how different countries, including us, should respond to that. But I guess I would simply say, as a contextual piece, I do feel that that change occurred before I think we started to think about how we react to it.
Hi, Virginia Wills. Before I rushed home to watch the federal budget, I went to Town Hall here in the city of Melbourne and heard about the draft council budget, which is currently up for consultation. So my question's about, it actually also had a surplus, very small surplus, but they increased rates to the state cap of 2.75%. I think it was called a Goldilocks budget. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term.
Well, usually treasurers describe them that way.
So the question is about intergovernmental cooperation. There's federal assistance grants and the like that haven't really changed since the 1990s.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, look, I mean, and this is a huge topic, and I'm not going to be able to do it justice, but look, suffice to say that I think we have a federal system, and it's very complicated. And I mean, I'm not somebody who dwells too much on, would it be better if we didn't have local government, or would it be better if we didn't have state government, it had massive local governments. I kind of feel like, look, we are where we are. Now, a lot of empirical studies on forms of government have been a bit mixed on this. Like, federal systems are messy, and you find all three levels working on health together, and that's inherently a bit inefficient. But having said that, there's a kind of competitive tension in federal systems where you can try things in one jurisdiction. There's also arguably more subsidiarity in federal systems where you can push things down to more local levels to some degree. So look, there are pros and cons, and my understanding is most of the empirics comes out a bit, ambiguous. And when you look at federal systems like Australia, Canada, the US, Germany, like each of those systems have pros and cons, but they're all pretty well-functioning systems. But so then I think the question is, how do you get all the different systems of government working better together? I mean, I think there are some concrete things we could think about. I think, without wanting to sound, again, trite, I think more clearly defining areas of responsibility, like clearly all three levels of government are going to have responsibility within health, but I think we could do a better job of delineating. I think your point about grants is a really interesting one. I mean, certainly I recently completed a major inquiry into competition, and one of the things that previous economic czars said to us was that we should be bringing back competition payments. So that was something in the 80s and 90s that people felt worked well, where often competition reforms might lead to disproportionate benefits to the federal government, and so reduce the incentive for the state governments to bring them in, but so that you could correct the incentives a bit through those kinds of payments. Local government grants and their sufficiency is a particular issue. At the last Labor National Conference, whether or not they should be increased to 1% of Commonwealth revenue was raised again. I think it's been raised about 4 national conferences in a row now. Now, the government didn't contribute to that particular number, but there was a really healthy debate around the fact that local government is expected to do so much. They're at the forefront of so much service delivery, cradle to grave. They're also at the forefront of so much asset management and dealing with natural disasters. Your income base is highly efficient in a lot of ways, rates compared to a lot of the distortionary taxes at other levels of government. So look, there are lots of arguments that your revenue base should be more secure. I mean, ultimately it comes down to the reality of budget pressures year to year.
Thank you. And we've got time for one last question, and it's from one of our online guests today. Rebecca will read it out.
Yes, this comes from Victorian Homelessness Network. They're asking if unemployment increases, we'll see more people in job seeker, and not being able to house them means that the complexity of issues they are facing will increase. Does the government have future plans to address this?
Look, I think, the government has a raft of housing policies more generally, but I won't deny that this is a very tough area to turn the dial. And again, I'm sure we could have a whole 2-hour discussion on housing. My view is, and this comes partly from having been in state parliament and now in federal government also, is that this is one of those wicked problems where it is literally going to take many, many levers. And I think there are definitely people in this room with very, very smart ideas that would move it forward a lot. But I think it's probably going to take all of those ideas to move it forward in totality. Like, I mean, I tend to, in this job, talk to people about the need for more land release, the need for faster approvals, but also talk to people in the construction industry about all the constraints they feel they're under. And then of course, you've got the federal government now with this housing accord, trying to bring all 3 levels of government together, plus the superannuation sector, plus the construction sector. Look, so I think I just kind of the federal government is trying to move the dial on housing. And then there's the particular issue of, homelessness. And look, there's a range of programs that have been have had their funding increased over the course of these budgets. But I fully understand that that's not going to necessarily fix the situation quickly for everybody. I mean, the only other thing I'd say is that I was on a Workforce Australia Select Committee chaired by Julian Hill. Another aspect of this, I think, is that you know, for many people who are on benefits and in precarious arrangements, I think we have moved towards a system which can be very draconian. And one of the clear recommendations coming out of that, and this is only a small part of the issue being raised, but one of the issues that came up a lot was mutual obligation and all of those kinds of aspects of the system. And we very clearly recommended, you know, dialing that down materially, which I think is a very humane and sensible thing to do. So I think that's also a part of it, giving people much more security in their underlying income also.
Thanks, Daniel. Thank you. Please join me to thank Daniel Mulino. And I'd just note on that last subject, we'll be putting out our own budget analysis. There's actually quite a lot of changes in the budget that were announced in the budget around mutual obligations and the treatment of job seekers, all of which are moving in the right direction, and a lot of which has been overlooked. So we'll be putting out some information on that. Thank you for unpacking a tricky budget at what is a difficult time. We will be here back on the 19th of June, returning to our third Wednesday of the month, next month, with Jennifer Rayner, who's going to be talking to us about her new essay in the Monash in the National Interest series, which is called Climate Clangers, the Bad Ideas Blocking Real Action. Jen is probably known to some of you. She's a former political staffer, but she's now Head of Advocacy at the Climate Council, so she'll be speaking to us next month. And of course, before you go, there are on your tables these little fabulous booklets from our friends at Labour Academy, authored by my friend Janet McCullman. Please consider buying one of these today to support the Academy. You can see Janet, or is Josie still here? Yes? No? Yes? Janet's on table 3, and do support the Academy if you can. The last thing I'd say is we are also coming up to the end of the financial year, so you will see in your inboxes very shortly an appeal to support per capita. Please consider, if you are in a position to do so in this time of cost of living crises, making a small end of financial year tax deductible donation so that we can continue our work. We've got a big agenda in the years ahead around issues like peace building, taxation reform, the housing challenge, and we're really going to be getting into some of the nuts and bolts of the Future Made in Australia agenda as well. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next month.